Welcome to Behind the Headlines. This week we're taking a look at king tides and their impacts on the Palo Alto Baylands. And joining us is Palo Alto naturalist Corinne Debray, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I guess we'll just jump in. What are king tides?
Well, king tides are the highest of the high tides that happen each winter. We have high tides that happen twice a day usually, and high and low tides, and then we also have higher monthly tides that happen when there's a full moon and a new moon. But during the winter, when we've got both the moon and the sun closest to the earth, we have extra gravitational pull that's happening, and so we get the highest of the high tides. So king tides are naturally occurring. The term started in Australia and New Zealand, but now is used very frequently here to talk about these very high spring tides, if you will. So we're really lucky that we live near a bay and that we can go out and experience those firsthand.
And you said the highest of the high tides. So how
Yes.
high in general are king tides, or do they just differ?
Great question. It depends on where you are in the bay and where you are on the coast, because there's landforms and there's weather and there's other factors that can influence how high those tides are. But we measure them from about an average kind of low point. And so we're talking about a normal high tide in Palo Alto Baylands would be somewhere around maybe even as low as 5 feet, maybe 6, maybe 7 feet. On a high day, maybe 8 something. But the king tides are maybe 9 feet. And the highest one that we've measured out there is probably 9.4, 9.5 feet in recent decades. So
It's almost double. Huh?
yeah, so it's enough where you've got a couple of feet where you can really notice the impact.
Yeah, so the last one was on January 11th? Is that when you were
Correct. We
were
had
out there?
the first one of the season was Christmas Day back in December, and that was during a new moon. And then this one in January 10th, 11th, and 12th was when the peak was. That was happening during a full moon. And then our last king tide that I think we'll have a walk as well. So for those that missed and are interested in this, we have one more walk on Sunday, February 9th. Correct. And if you go to the California King Tides Project, they have a lot of great information around the bay about different walks, that you could go on, or different activities around the tides. But the one on February 9th will be, or 8th and 9th, will be around 9 feet. And the ones this past in January, mid-January we had just had, were around 9 feet. So not the highest that we've ever seen, but enough, again, to notice the difference. So.
And so I went on the walk with you on January 12th, and
Yes.
Obviously we saw some species that we don't typically see. We saw a ridgeways rail, and we were talking about how a lot of the egrets were just really close to people, and I was wondering if you could explain why do the species kind of come out of hiding that we don't typically see, and why are they so comfortable kind of being, it seems a little closer to humans at times. Yeah.
Right. I think a lot of the wildlife to adapt and to live in the water and in the marshes along the baylands, or along the coast for that matter, you have to be adaptable. And so these birds seem to know, when there's a high tide and a low tide. We also talked about in the walk that some birds or some wildlife benefits, during a king tide day. Others are really scrambling and probably don't like the fact that they have to suddenly find higher ground, and that would include those ridgeways rails that we saw, and maybe the endangered mice that we hope are still there too, which we did not see.
The harvest mouse, is that right?
Exactly, the salt marsh harvest mice. And they're hidden down in the pickleweed there. This is a pickleweed marsh that we have out in the Palo Alto Baylands as part of our nature reserve out there. And so a lot of things that we saw that are endangered are types of species that only live in those particular pickleweed marshes. We also had grasses and other things and other plants. But when these tides get very high, these endangered species especially, which are people are come off from all over and are interested in seeing, start climbing up towards finding the highest plants, the highest point of the land. So it's a way for them to stay dry. Normally they'd be underneath where we couldn't see them, unless there's a normal very high tide or very low tide, in which case that's your best shot at being able to see.
So you're
some of
saying
these
when
birds.
there's these king tides, you're apt to see species that you might not otherwise see other times of the year?
Certainly with the Ridgway's rail.
I want to call on February 9th because I saw the photos and I was mad that I missed the walk. Because I was thinking, oh, it's just going to be higher water levels. And I didn't realize how different the bay looked with the king tides coming in.
Well, and I think the fact that we just were talking about this earlier was that you've got a marsh, you've got a fully intact functioning marsh, you know, so you've got a complexity of wildlife to look at, to observe that is really almost unsurpassed. You know, we were talking about if you go up to San Francisco and a lot of the developed areas, you've got, you know, waves coming against concrete, and so you don't have that marsh that's providing us with some not only buffer from storm waves, but it's cleaning the water as it goes down from the rain, and it's certainly a big habitat for wildlife. It's sequestering a lot of CO2, producing a lot of oxygen, which is why it feels so good when you're out there for a walk. So, you know, I could go on, but, you know, we have the ability in the Nature Center there, the City of Palo Alto's Nature Center, Lucy Evans Baylands Nature Center, to look at a drop of bay water and to see from the complete food chain, from the plankton on up to the birds, just how, you know, how all these levels are being affected on a daily basis with tidal change and with temperatures and salinity and things like that. So we love having families and people come and visit us and being able to show them that, so that on a king tide day, it's you really step back and say, wow, what's happening with, you know, all these other things that are out there, that complex web that's all tied together. But yeah, people come from all over to see the endangered birds, so that was very exciting to see.
You said you had 1,000 people on.
Yeah, I think the weekend, certainly, we see a lot of people during open hours on the Nature Center, but, you know, I can tell you that even during open hours, half those people are going right around the board, you know, to the boardwalk. And so if you look at the environmental volunteers that did a walk on Saturday next to us, and you looked at us and the people were coming off before and after hours, you know, I think it's a reasonable estimate to assume that there was 1,000 people. Maybe even more.
So you were just saying that, you know, we're just talking about the species that we see when the tide is really high.
Right,
So what happens when it's the opposite, when the tide, you know, recedes a lot?
That's
because
right.
I was there on January 13th and when the tide was really low, and it looked like there were a lot of shorebirds just hanging out on the mud banks that we hadn't seen the day before, because we literally couldn't see the mud
Are the
banks.
low tides part of the king tide? Like whenever you have an extra high, you have an extra low?
Absolutely. In fact, the big focus always seems to be on the high tides, but we also have very low tides too. So we have negative tides. So just as the low tide might normally be just a couple of feet, I think the lowest you'd probably see would be, you know, negative 1.3 or something out there. So that's enough so that the restaurant is open for the birds, because most of those are going and running around the mud and refueling. A lot of the birds that are visiting our marsh, where their hotel and restaurant, are a stopping place where these migratory birds are going through. So what I love about being out there is at different times of year you see different birds, and our winter birds, if you will, out there include these little tiny sandpipers with legs about this tall, and so when that water goes up over a certain level for them, that restaurant is closed. They can't go running around in the mud like little sewing machines, and that's what it looks like when they're trying to catch up when that low tide finally hits. It's great for them, and they're trying to fuel up so that then they have that energy for that long journey. They start out in Alaska and then maybe go down as far as Central America. So it's really important. That's why they don't seem to notice humans as much, because they're so intent on taking advantage of that moment, whether it's low tide or high tide this time of year. So
now you brought some props with you. So.
I did. It's difficult to explain the king tides without a really nice animation. Okay. But I thought that we could, talk a little bit about what's happening, during a king tide day. So we've got the sun, which is about 400 times farther away than the moon is. And you'd think that it would exert much more gravity, but it's also about 400 times, it's 400 times farther away. It's also 400 times wider than the moon, coincidentally. But again, because it's normally so far away, the moon is what influences the tides on Earth more, except for when you get the sun coming in around January 2nd, around the first week of January. That's the closest that we get to the sun. And so that's kicking in, again, an overdrive, sort of the tides. So when you get these two things all aligned, so in this position, this would be when we have a new moon. And then if you have the moon that's rotating on the other side, which is rotating around us over here, then that would be a full moon. And so when you have these three planets lined up, you have what's called syzygy, which is a great Scrabble word, S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y. And so that just means when three planets are lined up like this. So when you have this happen, you've got this bulge that develops, which is what we were sort of putting down here. Is almost like not to scale. None of this is to scale. But you have the Earth suddenly rotating around these sort of bulges of water, which give you very low tides on this side, and then very high tides where it's being sort of pulled in the direction here. And the gravitational force is both ways, but it definitely affects the water. The water is not solid like the Earth, and so it's going to be more affected than something that is the dirt.
So it's kind of like a tug of war?
You can think of that. Yeah. I mean, so you can think of that. And when you line up two teams to play tug of war, for example, you're in a straight line. You know, you're exerting maximum force like this way. Now, when the moon is in this position right here, and when we see a half moon, this is actually called a quarter moon positions, but this dilutes that gravitational force. And so you'll have lower high tides. Okay. You'll have less magnified tides. And the same thing, you know, if it's in this position, then you'll have, you know, that force is sort of diluted, so a bit. But this was the Christmas Day high tide or king tide look like this. The one we just had in the, again, not to scale, in January looked like this. And then, so we, you know, again, new moon and new moon and full moon, both, you know, you have that line up in a straight line like this. So.
Is it unusual to have three back-to-back king tides, or is that?
No, it's not common? Actually, because usually January that's the peak, because again, that's when the sun is the highest. Okay. And the closest to us and the highest in terms of the magnitude of gravity that it's exerting. These are not round orbits, they're elliptical orbits, and so, you know, it's sort of, there's certain times a year where it's closer, it's not as regular as sort of twice a year, but, you know, this elliptical orbit, it gets closest to us and what they call the perihelion period, and there's a perigee sort of moment here too, where, meaning that these are all the closest that they're going to get. So when you get the convergence of those in January, and again, the sun, because of the sun's orbit, they're closest to us in January, early January. And then you'll have two king tides on the either side, just like you would with the moon, where as it gets closer, you know, then it starts going up. It just doesn't like spike up in one day. And so same thing, as this gets closer, you know, and we had Christmas, you know, December 25th, and then it gets really close in January. And sometimes, relatively speaking, it's still closer enough where early February we might have a third one. So,
have you noticed, like, over the years, have the king tides been getting more intense, or, I mean, have the levels been getting higher, or has it stayed pretty much the same?
Yeah, I think you've hit on some really important questions that we get that relate to sea level rise, for example. And so when you plot the overall base, you know, sort of sea level, if you get forces on top of that with wind and waves during the winter especially, which is why it can go higher than sometimes the predictions with low pressure systems, you start getting sort of magnified effects. But you'd think, oh, it must be really easy. They just, you know, measure the water and it goes up in a straight line. Well, it's goes up and down seasonally, and it goes, you know, it really varies with a lot of other things that are going on.
I think you said in the story that it's not the same, that sea level rise isn't the same.
Absolutely.
Even in the bay, you said there's different places.
Yeah. So if you're living on Mount Diablo, that's a relatively, you know, newer mountain range than the Coyote Hills, which are right in front of that. When you look from the Palo Alto Baylands to the East Bay, if you lived on Mount Diablo, you know, that's still going up a little bit every year. And so, you know, you may not notice the sea level rise if you're living, you know, on the slopes of Mount Diablo. But if you're living on bay fill, and especially that when the bay was filled in before they knew a lot and had heavy machinery where they could gradually consolidate and compact things, that might be, if it's on mud that was fill, then it might be sinking more rapidly. And so you've got some earth that's going this way, some earth that's going this way. If you live up in the Pacific Northwest, you're actually part of the plate is going up, and so they're going to notice the sea level rise a little less. So you've got many factors that figure into that even the base level that you're adding the king tide on top of. And then from year to year, the ocean conditions and everything else will mean that that like with the king tides that we had this year are relatively modest. They were really just at 9 feet. So even though the base level might be a little bit higher, when I started doing these walks, they were saying, well, it's about a nickel, the sea level rise is going up, that base level about a nickel a year. Now they're saying a nickel and a dime together. And so that doesn't sound like much. On the ruler, if you look at we're lucky we have records that they started keeping at Fort Point in San Francisco in 1850 when California became a state. So we knew that when I first started doing this that it was about 8.5 inches, that over since 1850.
Right around there.
And so now that was assuming that the water was going up about a nickel a year, but the rate of rise has gone up greater over time. So now again, it's not doubled, but it's about a thickness of about a nickel and a dime. So if you're as old as I am, during my lifetime, that could add up to a larger period of 3.3 millimeters a year, which when I was first talking to people, it was closer to 2. That's 1.29 inches. Or 33 millimeters a year. So, that's, again, you start talking about 60 inches, then over a course of a lifetime and or more, then we're talking about real water. So as usual, I think I've given you a too long answer, but
No,
does that
visuals
help address?
as well. No, it does help address that.
Yeah.
So what are, when you're out leading these guided tours, you've been doing this for a while out there, right?
Right.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions people have, or some of the most common questions people have about the king tides?
Well, I think it's just the technically how does it work part. And so, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water. The technically how does it work part stumps people.
Yeah.
And so, and so I think there are some people that come out and there's different levels of people. We have astronomers that come out there. We have tech people that come out here. We have people that are visiting from other areas. Sometimes we have young people and families, and sometimes the children are super smart, and they will know more than I do sometimes. So there's a variety of people. So I really try to adapt to whoever I'm speaking with and not assume too much. There are people that really have never spent much time outdoors, and so to give them the opportunity to just see the regular tides going up and down every day and how it might be different in San Francisco and why would it be bigger down in Palo Alto Baylands than it would be in San Francisco. Doesn't that attenuate, that force of the tide get smaller when you go down? Actually, when you're in a funnel-shaped bay, it can increase the magnitude, not just of a king tide, but the force of the tides in general. And so you have these huge tidal swings in Canada, in the Bay of Fundy, which is about 52 feet. And, so that's big. I mean, that's over 15 meters. And then you have, in the United States, you have a funnel-shaped bay sort of also up near Anchorage in the Cook Inlet, and that would be almost 40 feet difference. So you have to watch the tide tables if you're going out for a boat ride or something there. And then we have some, again, some 8-9 foot rises on a fairly shallow South Bay. So we're sitting on mud, some of the time
That's
too.
interesting, because I would have thought it would have lessened as it got towards the
And
bay.
I think you asked about misconceptions. I think that's normally if you ask people, what do you think, do you think San Francisco's having a bigger tide than us, or do you think, that people will, that's sort of a moment, and but that's where where they talk about the land shapes, can also make a big difference. Also, if you're talking about how flat the land is, it's easy to not to underestimate the fact that if you're only this high up from the edge of the water table, all it takes is just another foot, and if it's completely flat, it just spreads out in a real hurry. So you could get local flooding in an area that's sort of low lying, but also that's just there's no elevation there to sort of keep it down at a certain level.
Is that what we have in the Palo Alto Baylands? Just and then it floods in?
I'm glad that you mentioned that and that you use those gestures in particular because, again, this goes back to this marsh. This marsh is like a big sponge. It's providing us with huge benefits, not just wildlife habitat, but just infrastructure benefits. And part of that is that it's like a big sponge where it can absorb actually some of the water. So it's not like a direct, like 9-foot wall of water. But it also is elevated a little bit. If you go out to the edge of the marsh, you'll see all that mud and that sediment, over many, many, many years, and with grasses and everything attached to it, is forming a little bit of a cliff, if you will, and that water's just banging against that mud. A couple hundred years ago, you would have had more shellfish beds, sort of ringing in front of the marshes. So we'll see what happens, to that. But for right now, that really does provide us with a lot of protection. So,
is there anything else that we didn't ask you about? Or?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that too. So there's some great opportunities, not just for king tides, but again the February 9th one, which it's free, but as most all of these walks are that we're talking about. But we sometimes ask people to register for the larger events, just so we know how many people are coming. But I give free nature walks at 10:30 and 12:30 every Sunday when I'm out as a part-time naturalist for the city of Palo Alto at Lucy Evans Baylands Nature Center. And as I mentioned before, we have a lab, we have birds you can look at.
So you just can show up at the center?
That's correct, on Sundays at 10:30 and 12:30. And and I have my colleagues are there during other days of the week, but Saturday and Sunday are when we have the biggest
And if you want to register in
turnouts.
advance, what's the site to go to?
You would go to eventbrite.com and search for King Tide Walk on February 9th in Palo Alto, and you should be able to find it. And that'll be the last walk. It'll be a joint walk that I'm doing with the Environmental Volunteers, another great organization out there that's taking a lot of really great education modules into the schools around the Bay Area. So we do summer camps and we do field trips. My colleagues do great field trips out there, and so the kids get to net fish. They really get a chance to look at the water, measure the water, and so we're really hoping to try to get as many people out there year round, not just for king tides, to show them how things work. So
Great.
yeah.
Well, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. Thanks for joining us. If you want to stay up to date with Palo Alto news, go to paloaltoonline.com or follow us on social media. Thanks.